Of course, as you might imagine, ethical egoism has its detractors, and these detractors make some pretty significant charges against ethical egoism. One of those charges is this, is that ethical egoism resolves conflicts of interest by encouraging people to fight as hard as possible for their own interest and to crush their opponents, unless fighting that hard and crushing your opponents is not in your interest. So you can see that if we operate from the assumption that there is no value beyond the best interests of each individual, and each individual is ethically charged with advancing their own best interests, how do we resolve a conflict where interests are in competition with one another, where we have conflicting or competing interests? And there doesn't seem to be a value beyond those individual best interests that we could appeal to as a way of resolving conflicts. And this, opponents say, is going to encourage people to be antisocial, to fight things out, kind of dog eat dog. Another charge against ethical egoism is that it violates that principle of impartiality. Remember, the principle of impartiality, which is a necessary component for our ethics to be consistent, says that we need to give every person equal consideration unless there's a morally relevant reason to not do so. And the charge here is that ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary because it requires us to privilege or prioritize our own interests over the interests of others simply on the basis that these interests are ours. Okay? So the ethical egoist, the claim here is you're prioritizing your own interests above those of others, and that's not giving everybody equal consideration. That's giving you more consideration than others. And therefore, that's not a consistent ethic. That's not something that harmonizes well, because you're violating this principle of impartiality. Of course, the ethical egoist may respond back to this and say, well, yes, every individual prioritizes their own individual best interest, whether you like it or not. That's just a fact of life. And so it's not that I'm arbitrarily elevating mine over everybody else's. It's that everybody arbitrarily, not arbitrarily, everybody prioritizes their own interests above all of those of others because their own individual best interests are the thing that is most important to them. And therefore, it's the fact that it's most important justifies that unequal consideration. Another charge against ethical egoism is that it opens the door to some potentially kind of horrific behavior that by the principles of ethical egoism we actually might be able to justify. So consider this. A pharmacist fills prescriptions for cancer patients with watered down drugs and thereby increases his profits. Okay, if an ethical egoist could do this and not get caught, and it advances their best interest of increasing profits? What about this? A paramedic gives emergency patients injections of sterile water rather than morphine so he can sell the morphine on the black market. If he can get away with it? How about this? Parents feed a baby acid so they can fake a lawsuit claiming the baby's formula was tainted. If you can get away with it as an ethical egoist? 13-year-old girl is kidnapped by a neighbor and kept shackled in a basement for 181 days while she is sexually abused. Again, if the ethical egoist can get away with it, and for some reason it turns out this is actually in that person's best interest, then wouldn't they do it? It's hard to differentiate a psychopath from an ethical egoist in each of these cases. And kind of shockingly, each of these four situations are actually situations that have occurred in real life. You can look them all up. They're events that actually occurred. And so in order to convince an ethical egoist in any of these scenarios that it's actually wrong for them to do these things, even if it does advance their own best interest, if they believe it does, we'd have to actually be appealing to the ethical egoist who wants to do these horrific things and saying, these things are wrong to do because they're wrong for you. Which causes some to claim that ethical egoism isn't even really an ethical theory, because ethics typically is thought of as rules and principles that guide how we treat others. And ethical egoism flips that around and says, no, my ethics are rules and guides for how I treat me, not others. Others are secondary. Others are just the recipients of my behavior. But what makes my behavior right or wrong is not how it impacts them. It's how it impacts me. And that's, some claim, that's not a real ethical theory. All right, so that's ethical egoism.